Plants vs Zombies is now 15 years old. It's no surprise that some plants have undergone massive changes and iterations throughout the course of the franchise. Whether it be changes to the plant itself or changes to the games around it, such a plant may find its utility fluctuate drastically over time. One such plant has been a recurring figure since the very beginning in 2009, who, despite all odds, rose from a controversial past flooded with changes and alterations to become one of the best plants in Plants vs Zombies 2. This plant is none other than Torchwood. But how has Torchwood fluctuated so much throughout the course of Plants vs Zombies 1 and 2? Well, let's chronologically dissect the tumultuous history of Torchwood. Torchwood's roots lie in the game that started it all, Plants vs Zombies. Torchwood was a 175 sun cost supporting plant that would boost pea shooter plants. It would do so by igniting their pea projectiles, doubling their damage and adding some splash damage. Torchwood was unlocked after beating level 3-7 in the adventure mode, at which point he could be combined with repeater, three-peater, or most notably gatling pea to create extremely high damage setups. Torchwood was a very good plant in this game as part of these setups, only a handful of zombies like Digger Zombie and Balloon Zombie would pose any kind of threat to him. However, since you unlock him towards the end of the pool stage, he can be quite situational for the adventure mode. Soon after you unlock him, you're pushed into the fog levels where no sun falls from the sky. In these levels, you benefit from using more frugal setups, and Torchwood is definitely not cheap for a supporting plant. Setups involving Torchwood can cost many hundreds of sun, even the most basic repeated Torchwood duo. One thing to note is that Torchwood can light up a tiny bit of fog, but this is way too gimmicky to be useful. Then after the fog stage you reach the roof stage, where pea shooters are nerfed massively by the slanted roof, which also causes Torchwood to be inefficient. Although Torchwood is a solid plant, the context of the part of the game at which you unlock him really impacts his usefulness in the adventure mode. But adventure mode isn't the only mode of the game. In survival, particularly survival endless, Torchwood is quite subpar. This is because as the mode progresses, you're increasingly pigeonholed into using setups like these, where Wintermelon, Gloomshroom and Cob Cannon do all the heavy lifting. With all those crazy amounts of zombies, Torchwood is essentially made obsolete. It certainly doesn't help that Torchwood doesn't synergize with any of these three plants at all. In fact, it has negative synergy with Wintermelon because the flaming peas thaw out chilled zombies. Again, Torchwood isn't bad in this mode, but it isn't anything special either. However, in the console and DS exclusive Versus mode, Torchwood is actually bad. Believe it or not, this is even considering Torchwood had a 50 sun reduction in its price in this mode. So what made Torchwood bad, even with that really generous buff? Well, this comes down to a few factors. First of all, seed slots. Bringing Torchwood into a level consumes one of your very limited seed slots. Often it's less risky to just bring a repeater and not a Torchwood because you need to use your other seed slots for more essential plants, like instance or specific plants that counter certain zombies that your opponent picks. Another reason Torchwood is bad in this mode is because a Torchwood setup simply takes too long and costs too much to be realistic. The Versus mode meta is defined by fast-paced, high-pressure gameplay. This is what makes cheap, spammable plants like Pushroom good, and expensive long-term plants like Torchwood bad. In this mode, it's hard enough to build a solid foundation of repeaters, so going the extra mile with Torchwoods is basically off the table. So overall in Plants vs Zombies, Torchwood is a pretty good plant that was limited by the game around it. In adventure mode, Torchwood could have been made a lot better if the worlds you could use it in were more forgiving, and in the survival and versus modes, it simply didn't fit in with the meta. Across the whole game, it was an alright plant. But this would all change in Plants vs Zombies 2, where Torchwood's inclusion was highly controversial. But what did they change about this plant to make it so controversial? Ironically, the answer is nothing. Plants vs Zombies 2 was released in 2013, and Torchwood was one of the lucky plants to be included from the original game. However, as players would start to play the game, they realized Torchwood wasn't so lucky after all.
Plants? Yeah, we can actually buy... Oh man, some of these things are just, like original Plants vs Zombies items, and now they're selling them? There's no way. So, okay, wow.
While Torchwood's functionality remained essentially unchanged from the first game, the method by which you unlocked the plant was drastically changed. Torchwood, among other plants in the game, actually costed real-world money to unlock. Even though this may not sound shocking now, back in 2013, the free-to-play mobile game model wasn't as widespread as it is today. Many players felt robbed that they had to pay money to unlock a plant they could get for free in the first game. This is why Torchwood's premium status was more controversial than, say, Power Lily, which was a brand new plant in the sequel. Taking a plant that fans of the first game enjoyed using and locking it behind a paywall was a highly controversial move. But unlocking method aside, despite Torchwood being nearly identical in the second game, its utility had changed because, well, it was a new game after all, with new zombies and worlds that could influence how useful Torchwood was as a plant. Plants vs Zombies 2 released with 3 worlds at launch, and was a drastically different game than it is today, being notably more similar to the first game than modern versions of the second game. Torchwood was a pretty good plant in those days because it fared well against all of the zombies except maybe Chicken Wrangler. Torchwood, like every other plant in the game, received a new ability due to the introduction of plant food. When plant food is given to Torchwood, its flames are made blue as it boosts P damage a lot more. This ability was special as most plant food abilities were temporary, but Torchwood's boost was permanent. In fact, with the much more limited pool of plants back then, Torchwood was the only offensive plant that had a permanent plant food ability, making its synergies with P plants even more destructive. While gatling P was absent from the game, at least back then it was, this didn't hurt Torchwood too much because it still had all of its other pea shooter buddies with the addition of P-Pod. Back then the plant balancing was a lot more balanced and better than it is today, so Torchwood fit right in as it wasn't power crept by any of the new plants, remaining a very good offensive option. So on release, Plants vs Zombies 2 Torchwood was caught in a bit of controversy and gameplay wise was on par if not even better than it was in the first game. This would all change however as the game started to be updated with new content. Dark Ages would be rolled out to the game in 2014, and this world was where Torchwood started to take some pretty big hits. The first of which being the Jester zombie. Jesters were PopCap's way of saying, screw you can't use pea shooters anymore. Jesters would reflect any projectile based attacks, including ignited peas back where they came from. This was a massive blow for Torchwood since it now had a zombie that completely hard countered it. Screen Door Zombie was the Jester equivalent, if you will, in the first game, but even then with enough firepower you could still use Torchwood to defeat them, it just wasn't the most efficient way. But in Plants vs Zombies 2, Jester zombies couldn't be beaten with a Torchwood setup, full stop. The Dark Ages Part 2 update would introduce a new pea plant which sounded like a step in the right direction for Torchwood, but no, that plant was Peanut. Torchwood and Peanut do not synergize with each other since both want to be planted in front of each other. Placing a Peanut behind a Torchwood wastes the Peanut's extra health, and placing a Peanut in front of Torchwood makes a Torchwood pointless. In either case, it's more effective and cheaper to just use a basic pea shooter or repeat a Torchwood setup. Torchwood would finally receive some good news with the release of the next world in 2015, Frostbite Caves. Torchwood was, and still is, really useful in this world. This is because of the chilling winds gimmick, which works exactly how you'd expect. Torchwood is beneficial here since it emits heat to plants around it, thawing them from freezing. At the time of this world's release, the only plants that could do this were Snapdragon and the new Pepperpult, making Torchwood especially useful in this world. However, Torchwood's reign in this world was well and truly over when Frostbite Caves Part 2 released, since Fire Pea was added to the game. Fire Pea basically stole all of Torchwood's thunder, functioning as essentially a Torchwood with a built-in pea shooter, also able to heat surrounding plants. To say Fire Pea was a direct competitor to Torchwood was an understatement. Fire Pea also had a very great plant food ability to rival Torchwood's, not to mention the fact that it costed gems instead of real world cash. That factor alone made Fire Pea much more accessible and popular for the player base, especially the free-to-play players. Since Fire Pea's release, Torchwood didn't quite feel the same. Whether Fire Pea is a better plant is subjective, but as I said, the fact that it was available without money certainly made it more popular of an option. Either way, Torchwood was trapped in the shadow of its successor. Perhaps this motivated PopCap to push Torchwood like they did in a quite unique way later that same year. A part of Plants vs Zombies 2 that I feel like is very forgotten, or at least not brought up much, is the fact that money premiums would very rarely be featured in the shop for gems around this 2015 to 2016 era. They only did this for a handful of premiums in very short windows, and one of them was Torchwood. Torchwood was available for 179 gems for just 1 week in September 2015 and very briefly again in September 2016, for only a couple of days that time. I like to think that PopCap did this as a reaction to Fire Pea's success as a gemium, which likely made Torchwood a less popular plant to purchase. But there's no way for us to know really. This was the first occurrence of Torchwood's unlocking method being tampered with, and it definitely wasn't the last, as we'll soon discuss. As the next few years rolled by, Torchwood wouldn't change all too much. Just about the most significant event for the plant was the introduction of the Excavator Zombie in Lost City Part 1, which countered the plant in a similar fashion to the Jester Zombie. I like to separate Plants vs Zombies 2's history in two distinct parts. I see modern Plants vs Zombies 2 as starting in 2017, since during and after 2017 they stopped updating the adventure mode with new worlds, and started shaping the game to be what it is today, with the plant leveling system, arena, Penny's Pursuit, power mints, CDM plants, and most importantly the removal of the mummy memory levels. These next few years would prove extremely important for Torchwood's forthcoming rise to dominance in the game's meta. Torchwood's place in the arena and Penny's Pursuit modes was similar to the adventure mode. Pretty good, but nothing special. The first shake-up for Torchwood came in the form of power mints in 2018, but not the power mint you're thinking of. Torchwood originally belonged to the peppermint family, which, in my opinion, makes more sense thematically. But clearly the devs don't care too much about that. As we all know, Torchwood would be moved to the appeasement family, which is where it would really shine. But appeasement on its own didn't really do much for Torchwood. Sure, it boosted it, but it boosted every other plant in the family, so that was nothing special. As more and more power creep and OP CDM plants were added to the game throughout 2018 and 2019, a lot of the original cast, including Torchwood, would become quickly obsolete. These plants were in desperate need of buffs, many of them approaching a decade old, and at the end of 2019, Torchwood would be the first to receive one, with other plants like Snowpea and Chomper following this trend later. Torchwood received perhaps the most considerable buff out of all of these plants, as it received 2 new abilities alongside a pretty hefty health increase. Firstly, Torchwood gained its ability to deal damage to zombies biting it, and secondly, it would now drop a milli jalapeno fire across its whole lane upon death. This buff would completely revitalize Torchwood overnight, from an outdated tired plant to a well-equipped versatile option. It really did make Torchwood feel like a brand new plant by fixing some of Torchwood's biggest and longest standing flaws. The health buff and close range damage solved the issue of Torchwood being completely defenseless on its own despite being planted far up the lawn where melee attackers would usually be placed. And the death damage was just straight up overkill. This allowed Torchwood to now not be completely countered by Jester and Excavator, since the death damage is enough to defeat them in the aftermath. There just wasn't really any reason to give Torchwood this ability on top of the others. If anything, it just makes it too powerful. And powerful it was with this buff, which instantly made it a powerful contender in the arena and Penny's Pursuit modes. Well, nearly. At its heart, Torchwood is and always has been a support plant. Yes, even though post-buff, it's very possible to beat whole levels with just Torchwood and not a single pea shooter. But no matter how good they made Torchwood on its own, it could still be even better with better plants it could support. Plants like Pea Shooter, Repeater, and Three-Peater were arguably becoming as irrelevant as Torchwood was at this stage, because of the apocalypse of overpowered CDMs. For context, Pokra and Impair were added in the update immediately prior to Torchwood's buff. That says a lot about the state of the game. The only missing piece to Torchwood's puzzle was a more overpowered lineup of pea shooter plants that would blow all of the other plants out of the water. And that missing piece would finally arrive as during 2021 and 2022, 2 new plants were released that have thus far permanently maintained a complete dominance over Plants vs Zombies 2 and its meta. Enter Peavine and Gatling Pea. Now, I won't go too much into detail about these plants because this is a video about Torchwood after all, but I'll go over the essentials. This plant is OP, and this plant is OP. Ever since Torchwood was ported over to the second game, it sorely missed its synergy with Gatling Pea. And with the arrival of Mega Gatling Pea, this void was filled. In fact, it was more than filled, since Mega Gatling Pea is an even more overpowered version of its former self. With the ability to literally plant food itself and subsequently shoot 5 peas at a time, Mega Gatling Pea became a dominant force in its own right. And as for Peavine, it basically turns Mega Gatling Pea in Torchwood into Mega Gatling Pea in Torchwood squared. Peavine works by boosting appeasement family plants that are planted on top of it. And if you remember from earlier, Torchwood is an appeasement family plant despite looking nothing like a pea shooter. So if Peavine boosts Mega Gatling Pea's damage and it boosts Torchwood's pea damage multiplier, what happens if you use a setup like this? Absolute carnage. The trio of Peavine, Torchwood, and Gatling Pea essentially became the holy trinity of Plants vs Zombies 2 plants. A title they still fall under to this day. They were such a broken combo in fact, that Popcat tried to nerf Peavine by allowing it to only boost 1 Torchwood per lane. But that didn't really do much as it was more of a quality of life patch than an actual attempt to balance these plants. Why? Well, without a doubt, PopCap is making a bunch of money from people buying seed packets for these plants. But after all that we've discussed, would you believe it if I said that's not all? These two new plants, Mega Gatling Pea and Pea Vine, are the only plants to have their plant food abilities boosted by Appeasement. So what happens when you use Appeasement on top of the Torchwood Pea Vine and Mega Gatling Pea combo? A horrific mess of massive flaming peas that's enough to crash my phone. With Torchwood's new overpowered CDM buddies, it skyrocketed from being a good plant post-buff to being one of the best plants in the entire game, capable of tearing up any and all arena levels and Penny's Pursuit levels. Well, unless they have jesters or excavators, but we don't talk about that. But there was still one thing holding Torchwood back, that being its unlock method, which was what made the plant so controversial to begin with. The final key to this plant's dominance was the fact that, in between Pea Vine and Mega Gatling Pea's release, Torchwood was made completely free. And no, they didn't just make it a CDM or Gemium, they made it a daily login reward. For playing the game for just 7 days, you're given one of the most busted plants for free, just handed to you. And with that, Torchwood has become the dominant force that it still is today in Plants vs Zombies 2. From Torchwood's humble beginnings in the original Plants vs Zombies, its history in the old Plants vs Zombies 2 was littered with setbacks and controversy. However, following a decade of mediocrity, a string of good luck and an increasingly beneficial environment around it finally allowed Torchwood to burn at full force. If you like this video, comment which plants you'd like me to cover the history of next. Koala out.